The Committee on House Administration will come to order. Good afternoon, everyone, and I want to apologize for being 50 minutes late, but we had votes on the floor of the House. I want to note we're holding this hearing both in person and remotely and in compliance with the regulations for committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 8. Generally, we ask witnesses who are joining us remotely to keep their microphones muted when not speaking to limit background noise. Witnesses will need to unmute when recognized for their 5 minutes or when answering a question. If you're joining remotely, please keep your camera on at all times, even if you need to step away for a moment, and please do not leave the meeting or turn your camera off. Lastly, for those who are joining in person, we're holding this hearing in compliance with the guidance just issued by the Office of the Attending Physician. Pursuant to the attending physician's guidance, anyone who is joining us in the hearing room must continue to wear a mask whether they are fully vaccinated or not. In addition, attendees who are unvaccinated must also maintain social distance separation. When recognized, members and witnesses may remove their masks to speak, but should replace them when they finish speaking. At this time, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point. All members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and have any written statements be made part of the record. And hearing no objections, that is so ordered. You know, election officials have faced unprecedented threats and harassment after they were unfairly blamed for election results in the 2020 election that certain politicians and voters did not like and did not want to accept. Last year, the threats for some election workers were so bad that they had to temporarily abandon their homes, spend their own money on increased home security, or even secure around-the-clock police surveillance. Election workers have had their young children and elderly parents threatened. For women and election workers of color in particular, the threats they've received have been particularly graphic and often include racist and gendered insults. Some election workers report that the harassment and threats are continuing to this day. A recent survey of election workers commissioned by the Brennan Center for Justice found that 1 in 3 election workers feel unsafe because of their job, and nearly 1 in 5 listed their lives being threatened as a job-related concern. Yet even in the face of these challenges and a global pandemic, election officials managed to run, quote, the most secure election in American history, according to a Trump official, with the highest turnout in more than 100 years. While the work election officials have done is heroic, several of America's political leaders have failed them. Former President Trump and his supporters have attempted to delegitimize the 2020 election results through the repeatedly debunked, quote, stop the steal movement fueled by the big lie, the unfounded theory that the 2020 general election was swayed by widespread voter fraud. This disinformation campaign has villainized election officials, many of whom believe that these claims are the reason that election officials are under attack. More than half of the election workers interviewed recently by the Brennan Center said that social media made their jobs more dangerous. Now, the threats to election officials have spread far beyond Trump and the Stop the Steal movement. In several states, party leaders have censured and replaced election officials who told the truth about the security and accuracy of the 2020 election. Dark money groups are taking advantage of and amplifying the spread of disinformation, weaponizing it to get legislation restricting access to the ballot introduced and passed in states. Legislators had introduced bills to impose criminal penalties on election officials who try to expand access to the ballot by taking steps like proactively sending mail-in ballot applications, and would subject poll workers to criminal penalties for removing partisan election observers accused of voter intimidation. Finally, state legislators have taken steps to divest local election officials of their power to run, count, and certify elections, turning elections into a partisan process subject to political interference. Congress has not only the power but the duty to act to address this deluge of subversive bills. To start, Congress should pass H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which would combat disinformation and prevent the kind of threats election officials have received. Additionally, H.R. 4064, the Preventing Election Subversion Act of 2021, would protect election officials by prohibiting the harassment and intimidation of election workers and restricting the removal of local election officials in elections for federal office without cause. It also protects voters from intimidation when voting in person by restricting who may challenge voters in federal elections and when those challenges may occur, and prohibits observers from getting within 8 feet of voters. We'll hear more about H.R. 4064 today. The work of election officials is fundamental to our democracy. They are dedicated public servants who administer free and fair elections. American democracy would not survive without them, and Congress needs to take steps to ensure they are protected. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I would now like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Davis, for his opening statements.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I get started, I would like to point out that today's hearing was scheduled at the same time as a markup in the Financial Services Committee, which both of my colleagues, Mr. Stile and Mr. Loudermilk, serve on. Just so you know, Madam Chair, my staff has reminded your team on numerous occasions that with 2/3 of our GOP committee members on that particular committee, one that actually sets their calendar a month in advance, I'd ask for some consideration in the future to take a look at the Financial Services Committee hearing schedule.
If I may address that, Mr. Davis, I know it is a concern and we do want the full participation of every member. However, I think it'd be more correct to say that they scheduled their hearing during our hearing because our hearing was noticed before theirs. We noticed our hearing on July 21st at 11:46 a.m. They noticed their markup July 23rd at 9 in the morning, conflicting with our previously scheduled hearing. But I do agree with you. We want all our members present, and thank you for.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you for your consideration. Thank you for your team for looking at that, and I'll jump into a financial services hearing to let my displeasure be known with Chair Waters for that one. Brian, you might have to relay that for me. This hearing on election subversion couldn't be more timely because there's a lot of election misinformation happening right now, and it's coming from the other side of the aisle. All last Congress and this Congress, I've sat through hearing after hearing after hearing, listening to my friends on the other side try to tell us there's voter suppression happening in Republican states across the country. Despite voter turnout breaking records in both the 2018 midterms and the 2020 general election across all races, my friends on the other side of the aisle continue to spread egregious misinformation about what is occurring today. When Senator Joe Manchin announced he would vote against H.R. 1, the Senate, and S1, in an op-ed, one of our colleagues from New York said his op-ed should have been titled, quote, "Why I'll Vote to Preserve Jim Crow," end quote. Another member from New York on CNN called it a voter suppression epidemic. President Biden has called these laws un-American, sick, Jim Crow in the 21st century, and the most significant test of our democracy since the Civil War. Additionally, the president has received 4 Pinocchios from even the most liberal fact checkers at the Washington Post for false claims about Georgia's laws. Vice President Harris recently suggested that voter integrity laws are concerning because, as my colleague Mr. Stile reminded us at the last hearing, people in rural areas do not have a Kinko's nearby. I'm from a rural part of the country, and I'm here to tell you that we are all perfectly capable and willing to follow the rules to protect the integrity of our vote. Democrat legislators from Texas recently fled their home state to Washington, D.C. to fight voter suppression. But when they were pressed about how these laws would actually suppress votes, they couldn't explain. That's because when you take the time to read the legislation and analyze these state laws, you'll find that in many states, Democrats are trying to claim voter suppression in the states that they're actually trying to claim voter suppression. They have less restrictive voting laws than many Democratic-controlled states like New York and Delaware. The states that are passing these laws are doing so in part to clean up temporary pandemic rules that were made during COVID but are not needed outside of a pandemic. Rules like 24-hour drive-through voting and others. The Supreme Court recently ruled in favor of states having the power to implement voting laws to protect the integrity of their elections, making it easy to vote, but hard to cheat. In the case against Arizona, Justice Alito's opinion stated, "One strong and entirely legitimate state interest is the prevention of fraud. Fraud can affect the outcome of a close election, and fraudulent votes dilute the right of citizens to cast ballots that carry appropriate weight. Fraud can also undermine public confidence in the fairness of elections and the perceived legitimacy of the announced outcome." Justice Alito also noted in a recent ruling that merely implementing reasonable voting regulations, such as rules to increase ballot integrity, does not equal discrimination, which is what my Democrat colleagues continue to misconstrue. Unfortunately, this election subversion is all part of their plan and continued push to nationalize our elections, creating the false narrative that states are passing racist laws to incorrectly justify the need for H.R. 1 and S1 and H.R. 4. This narrative is not only false, it's offensive. Our country has come a long way since the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and I think that's important to recognize and remember the history behind the need for that legislation and celebrate the progress that we've made, all while recognizing the ongoing importance of Section 2 to ensure that we never return to 1965. And there's no one better to talk about the horrendous voter suppression laws that occurred during the Jim Crow era compared to where we are now than our colleague, Congressman Burgess Owens. I'm honored to have Burgess with us today, and it's not just because he helped my favorite football team, the Oakland Raiders, win a Super Bowl in January of 1981, but Burgess grew up in the Jim Crow South in the 1960s, and during his testimony before the Senate hearing on S1, he said, "Jim Crow laws like poll taxes, property tests, literacy tests, and violence and intimidation at the polls made it nearly impossible for Black Americans to vote." He went on to say, "It is disgusting and offensive to compare the actual voter suppression and violence of the area that, quote, we grew up in with a state law that only asks people to show their ID." I look forward to hearing from Burgess, and I'll remind my colleague, Mr. Owens, I'm not giving your Super Bowl ring back. I took it as part of orientation. Thank you for that, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We are privileged to have three members of Congress with great knowledge about this subject before us, and I'd like to introduce each of them. First, Congressman Sarbanes has represented Maryland's 3rd Congressional District in the U.S. Congress since 2007. He currently serves on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce and the House Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change. He serves as Vice Chair of the House Subcommittee on Health. Congressman Sarbanes also serves on the House Oversight and Reform Committee and its Subcommittee on Government Operations. He chairs the Democracy Reform Task Force, which assembled H.R. 1, the For the People Act, to reform and strengthen our democracy. Born and raised in Baltimore, Congressman Sarbanes has experience working in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He's the lead sponsor of H.R. 4064, the Preventing Election Subversion Act of 2021. Congressman Owens represents Utah's 4th Congressional District. Born in the segregated South, as the ranking member mentioned, he saw people of all backgrounds come together to work tirelessly against adversity. A former NFL player, he was the 13th pick in the first round of the 1973 NFL Draft and joined the New York Jets, later playing safety for 10 seasons in the NFL for both the New York Jets and the Oakland Raiders, winning the Super Bowl with the 1980 Raiders team. After retiring from the NFL, Burgess worked in the corporate sales world and eventually moved the Owens family to Utah. Before being elected to Congress, he started Second Chance for Youth, a nonprofit dedicated to helping troubled and incarcerated youth. He now serves as a member of the House Education and Labor Committee, and with me and Mr. Raskin on the House Judiciary Committee. He believes in dreaming big and follows the 4 guiding principles of his faith, family, free markets, and education. And finally, but certainly not least, Congresswoman Williams, who represents Georgia's 5th Congressional District. She's been a fierce advocate for social justice, women, and families throughout her political and professional career. As a member of Congress, Congresswoman Williams continues to uplift the legacy of her mentor and predecessor, Congressman John Lewis, by fighting to prevent voter suppression and expand free and fair access to the ballot box. Congresswoman Williams was elected as the freshman class president for the 117th Congress. As president, she organizes and advances the interests of her freshman Democratic colleagues to fulfill their oath to work for the people. She currently sits on the Financial Services Committee, where she's vice chair of the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight, and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. The Congresswoman is also a member of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, and Mr. Davis and I serve with her there. She has membership in several caucuses, including the Congressional Black Caucus, the Democratic Women's Caucus, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the Voting Rights Caucus, the LGBTQ+ Equality Caucus, the HBCU Caucus, and she is the sponsor of H.R. 4064. So now we will hear from our witnesses. As you know, we ask you to summarize your statement in about 5 minutes, and the full statement will be made part of the record. Mr. Sarbanes, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairperson Lofgren and Ranking Member Davis, for inviting us to testify today and for the committee's continued attention to the most pressing matters that are facing Congress and our democracy. Our republic is built on the fundamental principle of self-government, the radical proposition that the levers of power in our society can only be exercised with the consent of the governed. We know that throughout our nation's history, we have struggled to deliver fully on this principle to ensure democratic rights for all Americans. Generations of our fellow citizens have been systematically denied the franchise. In fact, people of color, women, the disabled, and Native communities have been locked out of the ballot box for most of our nation's history. And while we have made progress in securing the right to vote in America, that progress is incomplete and increasingly under attack. Across the country, restrictive state laws, advanced in almost an entirely partisan fashion by Republican legislators and fueled by dark special interest money, are seeking to limit the franchise under the guise of rooting out fraud and promoting election integrity, even though experts agree that this past November's election, as you said, Chairman Lofgren, was one of the most secure in American history. These laws impose new restrictions on in-person voting, narrow access to new modalities of voting, such as vote by mail, and undermine the basic nonpartisan administration of elections themselves. I appreciate your focus in today's hearing on this last threat, commonly referred to as election subversion. Let's be clear. Election subversion is just voter suppression dressed up in new clothes. When a person's right to have their vote counted is ignored, abridged, or subverted, it strips them of their fundamental democratic rights. It suppresses their voice in their democracy. As Congress and this committee work to pass critical democracy reforms, we must recognize that the threat of election subversion and the threat of voter suppression are two sides of the same coin. As this committee knows well, the 117th Congress has been laser focused on building a stronger and more resilient democracy. This March 3rd, the House of Representatives passed the For the People Act, a bill our caucus labored long and hard to assemble with the help of Chairperson Lofgren and many of my colleagues on this committee and in this Congress. At the time of House passage, we were only beginning to witness the new spate of election subversion laws emerge. In fact, Georgia's SB 202 election law, first introduced on February 17th, contained none of the later subversion language that would appear in a flurry of last-minute changes in mid-March before the law's passage on March 25th. Before the ink on SB 202 was even dry, we set to work to understand the threats posed in Georgia and in other states across the country and to explore potential policy responses at the federal level. Recently, I joined with Chairperson Lofgren and our colleagues, Representatives Nikema Williams, Colin Allred, and Mondaire Jones in introducing the Preventing Election Subversion Act. Grounded in the Elections Clause of the Constitution, which gives Congress the authority to regulate the time, place, and manner of federal elections, this legislation would adopt a minimum substantive for-cause standard that must be met before suspending a local or county election official, while providing a federal cause of action to enforce this standard. The proposal would also allow a local election official who has the responsibility for federal elections and who has been subjected to removal proceedings by a state board of elections to bring that proceeding into federal court for redress. The legislation makes it a federal crime for any person, whether acting under color of law or otherwise, to intimidate, threaten, coerce, or harass an election worker, or to attempt such intimidation. Finally, the bill would establish a minimum buffer zone to limit how close a partisan poll observer may come within a voter or ballot at a polling location during an early vote period or on Election Day. We believe these measures represent an important contribution to our deliberations here in the House and with our Senate colleagues about the key democracy reforms in the For the People Act. By no means, though, do they represent the full universe of potential federal responses to the threat of election subversion. We continue to workshop additional policy approaches as we track new and more sinister subversion proposals at the state level that threaten to intentionally disrupt the nonpartisan administration of our elections. I thank the committee for your interest and look forward to offering any assistance and perspective I can in this critical effort to safeguard our democracy and preserve, protect, and defend the vote and the voice of every American. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sarbanes. A vote has been called on the floor, so I think we have time to hear from Mr. Owens and from Ms. Williams. Pardon me, and then we will recess and vote and return for the second panel. Mr. Owens, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Chairperson Lofgren and Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee for this invitation to join you today on this hearing. In April, I was invited to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing entitled Jim Crow 2021, the latest assault on the right to vote. The testimony I'll share with you this afternoon is similar to what I shared with that committee in April. My main point is the same. Whether you classify states' new election laws as Jim Crow 2021 or election subversion, your argument is flawed and offensive. As I'll explain, I experienced actual Jim Crow as a youth. The right to vote for many members of my community and family were actually subverted. State requirements today that require voters' ID, that actually expand voters' access, is not even close to the evil subversive practice of 1960s Jim Crow experience. My American story begins with my great-great-grandfather, Burgess, who arrived in America as a child shackled in the belly of a slave ship. Silas was sold on an auction block with his mother in Charleston, South Carolina, to the Burgess plantation. He escaped through the Underground Railroad and later became a successful entrepreneur, first purchasing 102 acres of farmland paid off in 2 years. My grandfather, Oscar Kirby, served our country in World War I and was a respected and successful farmer, raising 12 children, all of whom graduated from college. My father, Clarence Burgess Owens Sr., was stationed in the Philippines at the end of World War II. When he returned to Texas, actual Jim Crow laws denied him postgraduate education, raising in a generation that used these tactics as motivation. He received his PhD in agronomy at Ohio State University and had a successful career as professor, researcher, and entrepreneur. I grew up in the Deep South, in Tallahassee, Florida, in the 1960s, during the days of KKK, Jim Crow, and segregation, in the era of actual institutional racism. My first experience with white Americans wasn't until I was 16 years old. At 18 years old, I was the third Black athlete to receive a scholarship to play football at the University of Miami. Now, I proudly represent Utah's 4th Congressional District in the United States Congress. I sit before you today as someone who has lived the American dream, as have millions of Americans of all races from every background. This is due to our country's mission statement that all men and women are created equal. A mission statement that every American should have the opportunity for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. As someone who actually experienced Jim Crow laws, I'd like to set the record straight and the myths regarding the recently passed Georgia state law and those other laws across our country now called election subversion, which is absolutely outrageous. Here's a few examples of my life of what Jim Crow laws actually look like. Subversion, what it really looks like. At the age of 12, my father allowed me to participate in a demonstration with Florida A&M college students in front of the segregated Florida State Theater, which because of our color, we could not enter. I was the youngest participant there, and only 50 years later did I learn from my father that he had parked across the street to watch and make sure I was safe. In the 7th grade, my school never received new books. Instead, we received used old books from the all-white school across town. At service stations, there were white men only restrooms, white women only restrooms, and one filthy restroom in the back of the station for Black Americans designated as colored. In addition, subversive laws like poll tax, property tests, literacy tests, violence and intimidation at the polls made it nearly impossible for Black Americans to vote. The section of the state law seeking voter integrity that has brought so much outrage from the left simply requires any person, regardless of race, creed, or color, applying for an absentee ballot to include evidence of a government-issued ID on their application. If a voter does not have the driver's license or ID card, that voter can use a current utility bill, bank statement, government check, paycheck, or other government document that shows the name and address of this voter. If a voter somehow can't produce one of the above forms of ID, that voter may still cast a provisional ballot. By the way, 97% of Georgia voters where subversion where Jim Crow tactics were charged includes Black Americans already have government-issued ID. What I found offensive is the narrative from the left that Black people are not smart enough, not educated enough, not desirous enough for independence to do what every other culture and race does in this country, get an ID. True racism is this, the soft bigotry of low expectations. President Biden said of the Georgia law, this is Jim Crow on steroids. With all due respect, Mr. President, you know better. It is disgusting and offensive to compare the actual voter suppression and violence of the era that we grew up in with any state law that only asks people to show their ID. This type of fear-mongering I expected in the 1960s, not today. It's time for this subversive view of soft bigotry, of low expectation regarding Black Americans to end. We, like the rest of Americans, expect one thing called voter integrity. Our vote should count, it should be easy to vote, hard to cheat, and we ask no more, no less than every other American. I thank you and appreciate the opportunity to share this.
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you for your testimony. And finally, Congresswoman Williams, you are recognized for about 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lofgren. In the 2020 election, a record-shattering 4.93 million Georgians made their voices heard when they cast their votes. 6 weeks later, Georgians did it again, showing up in record numbers for the Senate runoff election that changed the direction of America forever. Taken together, these two elections represented one of the greatest moments for democracy in the history of Georgia and America. But then, Georgia's 2020 election results were placed under an unwarranted microscope by so-called election integrity watchdogs because of what was at stake. 3 recounts and multiple lawsuits later, the results were clear. Democrats and Republicans alike agreed our election was free from fraud. Our elections have been free and fair because of hardworking, nonpartisan election officials who are used to working behind the scenes to ensure that everyone's sacred vote gets counted. Georgia's Jim Crow 2.0 voter suppression law, SB 202, which was signed into law by Governor Brian Kemp, breaks down crucial safeguards for independent elections administrators. Most frighteningly, under SB 202, the Georgia State Election Board has the power to replace county election board members that it decides are underperforming, giving partisan election officials far too much control over the fair administration of elections. Partisan pressure and subversion tactics have no place in our elections, plain and simple. Unfortunately, election subversion is not some far-off hypothetical. Republicans in Georgia are actively working to replace the Elections Board of Fulton County, Georgia's largest county, my home county, which includes the city of Atlanta, just this week. This Monday, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger said, I've repeatedly called the state election board to use its authority under SB 202 to replace Fulton County's elections leadership. This is despite the Secretary of State previously certifying Georgia's 2020 election results and fighting against accusations of election fraud in the state. Additionally, on July 15th, House Speaker David Ralston sent a letter to Director Barron requesting that he ask for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to conduct a forensic investigation into the Fulton County Board of Elections procedures. These are only two examples of Georgia Republicans fueling election subversion as they played to their political base. But Governor Kemp, Secretary Raffensperger, House Speaker Ralston, and their colleagues are scared to say the quiet part out loud. Fulton County is full of voters who look like me. We might not be counting jelly beans in a jar, but election subversion seeks the same results, suppressing the votes of people of color and those most marginalized in our communities. Beyond undermining our democracy, targeting dedicated election officials is putting lives at risk. Director Barron and his staff have received death threats. Black staff members of the Fulton County Board of Elections have been called every racial slur that you can imagine. One poll worker, having been harassed by the former president, is now in hiding, and her life has been turned upside down. This needs to change, and ending election subversion should not be a partisan issue. Secretary Raffensperger's own employee, Gabriel Sterling, took a stand in December against members of his own Republican Party who are peddling conspiracy theories and undermining our democracy. Someone's going to get hurt. Someone's going to get shot. Someone's going to get killed, Sterling warned. It's not right. I thank the House Committee on Administration for holding this hearing because our democracy is at stake. It's not just Georgia where this is happening, y'all. Legislation has been introduced this year in nearly every state to limit access to the ballot box. We don't have time to wait and see what might happen. In Georgia, we conducted one election with the undemocratic SB 202 as the law of the land, and our next election will be here before we know it. The time to act is now. To anyone who wonders what they would have done during the civil rights movement, now is your time to find out. You're either on the side of democracy or you aren't. I look forward to continuing to work with Representative Sarbanes, my co-chairs of the Congressional Voting Rights Caucus, members of this committee, and all of those ready to defend our democracy and prevent election subversion. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back her
Madam
time.
Chair, I asked permission to assert a point of order, if I may.
What is the gentleman's point of order?
May I ask the question, did Congressman Burgess Owens stick around for the testimony of Ms. Williams, or did he withdraw from the panel?
Well, his camera is not on, so he may have left.
I would like to have an answer to that question. If he withdrew from the panel, that's a violation of the committee rules, and I would move to strike his testimony.
Well, I would ask that the gentleman suspend as a courtesy to the chair so we can discuss this further. We can bring this up later, but I think if he were here present and needed to go, we would accommodate that as we do to members. So let's discuss this further, and we'll, if necessary, we'll take it up after the recess. And we're now in recess for votes. We'll come back as soon as the votes are over. go to our witnesses. When we left, Mr. Butterfield had raised a point of order, which we had postponed for further discussion until after the vote. So, Mr. Butterfield, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Before the break, Madam Chairman, I raised a point of order because I had a suspicion that Congressman Burgess Owens had withdrawn from the panel. I do not know that to be a fact, and so I need to establish the facts before I reach my conclusions. May I ask the ranking member if Congressman Owens was present when Ms. Williams testified and able to hear and see her testimony as if he would have if he were in the committee room?
I don't know the answer to that. I know that Mr. Owens was going to vote like he would if he was in person because of the remote hearings and the proceedings that are so new. I think these are issues that maybe we can address in the future. I prefer that his words not be stricken because remote committee proceeding regulations only require that participating members keep their cameras on, not witnesses. If we continue down this path, we will argue that, you know, we're going to argue that he was not participating in the hearing. So, I mean, I think it's semantics on issues, and maybe we can get some clarification in the future.
I think it's more than semantics, Mr. Davis. I mean, I sat here for 5 minutes and listened to a Black history lesson from the gentleman. I'm the oldest one in this room, if I'm not mistaken, and I lived in the South. I live in the South. My parents and grandparents grew up in the South. I lived and breathed and suffered the Jim Crow South, and I did not need the gentleman to come here today and to give me a 5-minute lecture on voter suppression for African Americans in the South. What I needed for him to testify today about was election subversion in 2020, which was what the gentlelady from Georgia was testifying about earlier. And I only wish he could have heard her testimony because it was very powerful. Madam Chair, I will be inclined to withdraw my objection, but I would ask the staff if they would forward a copy of Congresswoman Williams' testimony to the gentleman for his consideration.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I'll forward a copy of Ms. Williams' testimony. I believe our team has provided written testimony for this entire hearing to Mr. Owens and his team. I'd be happy to relay that. I'm honored. I'm glad that you've decided to withdraw. I'm glad that we have another perspective of somebody that grew up in the Jim Crow South, not like I did not. I was in Iowa and Illinois, and I was not old enough. But to hear the perspectives from Mr. Owens and you and others, I think is important. So thank you for your withdrawal, and appreciate your friendship and consideration. And we will get that testimony to Mr. Owens and his team if we already have not.
I will withdraw it. Thank you.
The gentleman withdraws, and now we will go, and thanks to all members, we will go to our second panel. I'd like to introduce and reiterate, I think you heard at the beginning, for our remote witnesses, the rules require that you keep your cameras on at all times. If you're not speaking, we ask that your microphone be turned off or be muted to prevent background noise, and you can unmute it when it is your turn to speak or to answer questions. Each of you will be recognized for about 5 minutes, and your full statement will be made part of the record. So let me introduce our panel of witnesses. Gowri Ramachandran serves as senior counsel in the Brennan Center's Democracy Program. Her work focuses on election security, election administration, and combating election disinformation. She is currently on leave as a professor of law at Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles, California, where she has been granted tenure. She's taught courses in constitutional law, employment discrimination, critical race theory, and the Ninth Circuit Appellate Litigation Clinic. Her work is published in the Election Law Journal, the North Carolina Law Review, and the Yale Law Journal Online, among others. She received her undergraduate degree in mathematics from Yale College and her master's degree in statistics from Harvard University. While in law school, she served as editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal, and after graduating from law school in 2003, she served as law clerk to Judge Sidney R. Thomas of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in Billings, Montana. Adrian Fontes served as county recorder for Maricopa County, Arizona, the second largest voting jurisdiction in the United States, representing over 2.5 million active voters and approximately 2/3 of Arizona's population from 2017 to 2020. This position was the most recent in a long list of his service to his community and country. From 1992 to 1996, he served on active duty in the U.S. Marine Corps, and we thank you for that service, where he earned a nomination for Meritorious Commission. After being honorably discharged, he received his bachelor's degree from the Arizona State University before continuing on to the Sturm College of Law at the University of Denver. After law school, he served as a prosecutor with the Denver District Attorney. He worked in the Maricopa County Attorney's Office and then headed the Foreign Prosecution Unit at the Arizona Attorney General's Office. In 2016, he was elected to the office of the Maricopa County Recorder, where he served a 4-year term implementing national award-winning systems and procedures to improve accessibility and security for Maricopa County's elections, even amidst the immense logistical and personnel safety challenges posed on election administration by the COVID-19 pandemic. He remains a resident of Maricopa County, where he's raising his 3 daughters and practicing law. We have a Detroit City Clerk, Janice Winfrey, who is a native Detroiter. She's dedicated the last 13 years of her life to tirelessly and carefully servicing her community. When sworn into office in 2005, Clerk Winfrey accepted the responsibility to govern 3 charter-mandated roles: City Clerk, Official Record Keeper, and Chief Elections Officer. In addition to her day-to-day duties as Clerk and Chief Elections Officer, Clerk Winfrey has also found time to improve her skills and advance her profession by completing courses and certifications in the Election Center Training Program, the International Association of Clerks, Recorders, Election Officials, and Treasurers, and the Michigan Municipal League. She's also a member of the National League of Cities. Clerk Winfrey is a graduate of Cass Technical High School, where she has been recognized as a distinguished alum, and the Eastern Michigan University. And finally, we have Ken Cuccinelli, who is the chairman of the Election Transparency Initiative. During the Trump administration, he served as the acting director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and then as acting deputy secretary for the Department of Homeland Security. During his tenure, Mr. Cuccinelli was a leading spokesman for the Trump administration on immigration, election security, and Homeland Security issues, and was appointed by then-President Trump to serve as an original member of the Coronavirus Task Force upon the emergence of the pandemic. In addition to practicing law for over 25 years, Mr. Cuccinelli served in state government in the Virginia Senate from 2002 to 2010, and as Virginia's Attorney General from 2010 to 2014. Mr. Cuccinelli earned a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Virginia, a law degree from the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, and a master's in international transactions from George Mason University. We will recognize, as I say, each of you for 5 minutes. For those of you who are testifying remotely, there's a little clock on your screen that will tell you when the time is clicking down. For our witnesses who are present in the chamber, we have a set of lights, and when it turns yellow, it means there's a minute left, and when it turns red, it means your time is up, and we surely would ask you to summarize. And we hope to get through this panel entirely and our questions before the next round of votes. So let me turn first to Ms. Ramachandran. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chair Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss this critical issue today. This spring, the Brennan Center for Justice commissioned a national survey of election officials, which Chair Lofgren has mentioned. To repeat, we found that roughly 1 in 3 election officials feel unsafe because of their job, and approximately 1 in 6 listed threats to their lives as a job-related concern. In order for democracy to function, we cannot accept this situation. Election officials across the country, regardless of political affiliation, risked their lives in a pandemic to help us vote safely in 2020, with, as some members have referenced, the highest turnout since 1900, when women, Asian Americans, and Native Americans were not even permitted to vote. And how are they being repaid? With violent threats and intimidation, political interference, and disinformation campaigns that paint them as cheaters instead of the heroes that they are. As I indicated in my written testimony, I hope to make 3 points today. First, violent threats against election officials and associated election disinformation are ongoing problems. They are threatening the security of our elections. Congress should provide support for the protection of election officials and workers. Second, the Election Administration Commission and the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency have worked to help with combating election disinformation and malinformation, or doxing. This includes their work to promote auditable paper ballot systems. This work should continue with support from Congress. Third, Congress should protect election officials from partisan interference. This spring, we partnered with the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard's Kennedy School. We conducted interviews and conversations with dozens of election officials and over 30 other experts. This culminated in the report we published with the Bipartisan Policy Center that I've included with my written testimony. What we learned from these discussions was heartbreaking. Local election officials feel unsafe because they are being harassed and threatened in the wake of the 2020 election. Several of them reported that their family members, including elderly parents and young children, were harassed or threatened with violence last year. Multiple election officials told us that the persistent harassment forced them and their families to flee their homes and seek mental health treatment for their children. And when they reached out to law enforcement for help, the response was often insufficient to ensure the official and their family felt safe. In addition to the appalling harassment and threats, many experienced interference by partisan and political leaders. Former President Trump famously placed a phone call to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, in which he pressured Raffensperger to, quote, find 11,780 votes. But we also found that less sensational forms of this disturbing political interference abound. Many state and local party leaders have censured officials who simply told the truth and refused to undermine the legitimacy of the 2020 election. A law was passed in Georgia that replaces the Secretary of State as the chair of the State Elections Board with a legislative appointee. Other states have introduced bills that would criminalize acts like sending mail ballot applications to voters. Virtually every election official we spoke with indicated that this behavior is partially driven by mis and disinformation about the election. Lies about the election, in particular the lie that it was stolen, serve to instigate and legitimate attacks on election officials. One official compared the attempt to combat online disinformation using truthful information to screaming into a hurricane. Ongoing partisan reviews being conducted in places like Maricopa County present an example happening in real time how false claims of election discrepancies can be amplified by prominent voices. And the disinformation campaigns they fuel continue to harm election officials. When Secretary of State Katie Hobbs in Arizona spoke out against the incompetent review, credible threats against her increased, and the governor was required to provide her with a personal security detail. Our report identifies a number of solutions to these threats, including 3 ways Congress can help. First, the Department of Justice recently announced a task force to address the rise in threats and intimidation. Legislators should consider funding for safety training, including how to protect one's personal information and physical security of election offices. Second, the underlying problem of disinformation is daunting, and the private sector will likely need to play a large role. Social media companies should choose to promote truthful information over conspiracy theories, and hearings like this also play a role. Finally, Congress can explore legislation that protects election officials from partisan removals. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll turn now to you, Mr. Fontes. You're recognized for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Chair Loughran, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
I think your microphone is not on.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the threats against state and local election officials and our democracy. In 2018, one of my 3 daughters picked up a package on our front porch and brought it into the kitchen. Because of a recent threat against me, the bomb squad was called to conduct an investigation in my home. 2 years later, in the aftermath of Election Day 2020, armed protesters gathered outside of the Maricopa County Election Center, demanding that we count all of the ballots. Ironically, that's exactly what we were doing. But the misinformation and disinformation that had built to fever pitch motivated some of these people to corner one of my staff members outside the door, forcing what was effectively a rescue by law enforcement officers and other staff members. This is not a story about some deteriorating third world democracy on the verge of authoritarianism. This is America today. And unless everyone does their part and the truth prevails, we will face a level of uncertainty in this nation never before seen. My name is Adrian Fontes. I'm a graduate summa cum laude of the Arizona State University and the Sturm College of Law. You heard my bio, so I'll cut it a little short, except to say to any members of the United States Marine Corps or alums thereof, Semper Fidelis. But I don't come here as any one of those sorts of titles. I come to you as a county election official. I come to you representing the concerns, the stresses, the worries of tens of thousands of local, county, and municipal officials, appointed and elected temporary and permanent employees, volunteers, poll workers, clerks, election judges, marshals. We have dozens of titles, but most importantly, we are all Americans. I greatly appreciate that you have invited our voices into this conversation, and we encourage you to continue to listen to the voices of the folks who are most directly responsible for making our democracy work in service of this republic. We need your help. We need your protection. There's one more group I have yet to mention who will also get greater protection under the proposed legislation, and they're the single most important group of people in our democracy: voters. And they deserve your protection from intimidation and harassment as well. My written testimony describes the following in much more detail than I can get into. Many of the security and integrity measures that we put in place in Maricopa County, which resulted in an honest, fair, and safe election in 2020. The subversive efforts of the former administration and anti-democratic factions, which further perpetuate the mythologies and the widespread voter fraud, and how that's leaving election administrators as potential victims to threats of violence, harassment, and possibly physical harm. The harassment and threats of violence against election workers in Maricopa County I and my team experienced during my term in office and beyond are also there. And we speak a little bit in my written testimony about the coordination that we entered into with federal, state, and local law enforcement agents and other safety agencies. But before I conclude, I must express my gratitude here on the record to those people that I'm asking you to protect. I won't name them because they know who they are, and sadly, mentioning their names could actually result in additional threats against them. Their professional staff at the Maricopa County Recorder's Office and Election Department did the nearly impossible in just 4 years. We added 500,000 more voters to our voter rolls. And between 2016 and 2020, we saw 600,000 more ballots cast in one county alone, even during a global pandemic. That is access. This is work the whole team should be very proud of, and there's no level of lies, false conspiracies, fraudsters, or fools who will take away from these amazing people the work that we all accomplished. The Maricopa team, like teams around the nation, should stand proud for the work they did in 2020. It was a successful election, and nobody will ever take that away from the tens of thousands of Americans who did that work. I strongly support legislative efforts to protect election officials in Arizona and across the country from harassment, intimidation, threats, and political interference so that they can safely perform their duties to serve voters and protect election integrity. I deeply appreciate this committee's willingness to call attention to the ongoing national threat against state and local election officials and our democracy. I thank you, Chairwoman Lofgren, for your time, and I look forward to all of your questions.
Thank you very much for that testimony. Clerk Winfrey, you are now recognized for about 5 minutes.
Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify about the threats facing election administrators in Detroit and across this country for simply doing our jobs. I am the city clerk and chief election official for the city of Detroit. In this elected, nonpartisan position, I'm chiefly responsible for keeping the official records and documents for the city of Detroit, clerking the council and administering all elections. Detroit, also known as the Motor City, is nationally recognized as a comeback city. We've come through bankruptcy, a mass exodus of population, the loss of manufacturing jobs, and have made it through a global pandemic where we were defined as a hotspot. Approximately 80% of Detroiters are Black. During the 2020 general election, President Trump made numerous false allegations of voter fraud, insisting that the election was stolen. Consequently, state and local officials from both parties, poll workers, and election staff were and still find ourselves under attack. Threats were made against me, my staff, and Detroit poll workers by phone, email, and in person, such as when they counted the absentee ballots on Election Day. Trump and his conservative allies filed several lawsuits against me and other Michigan election officials as a part of their ongoing mis- and disinformation campaign that blames election administrators for their loss at the polls. All of these lawsuits were eventually deemed frivolous and deceptive in nature, and some of the attorneys are now facing sanctions. Even still, during the 2020 presidential election, Detroit, despite being in the middle of a pandemic and civil unrest, experienced a 51% voter turnout. Of the approximately 250,000 electors that voted, 174,000 cast their ballots by absentee, which was a record for our city. Detroit voters had a tremendous impact on the outcome of the presidential election in Michigan. Because of the spike in the absentee ballots, coupled with the state restrictions on processing and counting of absentee ballots prior to election, I expanded that operation by renting additional space in the TCF Conference Center in order to accommodate the necessary temporary staff and observers that we may complete the process transparently and safely. During the tabulation of the absentee ballots at the center, multiple GOP challengers had to be removed because of disruptive conduct. Some wore intimidating masks over their entire face. Others banged on the walls and the windows, shouting, "Stop the vote." Others violated social distancing standards and, as required by COVID-19 rules, refused to place protective masks over their noses when asked. It appeared that this disruption attempted to undermine the tabulation of the absentee ballots. A couple of weeks after Election Day, during the canvass of elections, I received a call from the Michigan Secretary of State, Benson, explaining that the Wayne County Board of Canvassers would refuse to certify the results unless I testified. During that time, both my husband and I were diagnosed with COVID-19, and we were quarantined. Nonetheless, to ensure the certification of the election, I left my husband's side at the hospital and reported to my office wearing multiple masks and adhering to the many recommendations of health officials as possible, but still placing my staff in harm's way to prevent the state board from disenfranchising hundreds of Detroit voters. Immediately following my testimony, I began to become harassed. I received insulting text messages on my private cell phone. Insults came by way of social media through my inbox. And the greatest threat came to me when I was taking a walk just to clear my mind. An unknown Caucasian male, approximately 6'3" and 250 pounds, approached me in my neighborhood and abruptly stated, "I've been waiting for you at work and decided to come to your house. Why did you cheat? And why did you allow Trump to lose? You're going to pay dearly for your actions." He approached me in a threatening manner, coming closer and closer, and my only recourse was to yell, "I have COVID-19 and I'll spit on you." Fortunately, a neighbor was driving by and asked me if I was okay. I immediately responded, "No, this man is threatening me." At that point, my neighbor began blocking his movement with her car so that I could safely get home. Later that evening, I received a message stating that he would blow up my block, and I was ugly. I then called the Detroit Police Department and explained what happened, and they began to surveillance my house in my area. As recently as February 2021, I was notified by the Detroit Police Department that my life was threatened by white supremacists and that the police would be patrolling my home for the next couple of weeks. My husband and I decided just to simply leave town. Our government is elected by our citizens. Therefore, voting is crucial to our democracy. Our job as local election officials is essential, and we are required to protect the act of voting. I ask that you consider it unlawful to harass, intimidate, and or threaten local election officials while we simply perform our jobs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that testimony. And we have now our last witness, Mr. Cuccinelli. You are now recognized for about 5 minutes, and you are remote, I believe.
Yes, ma'am. So Chairman Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me today to discuss the quality and integrity of our voting systems and the safety of the people who run them. Thankfully, it is already illegal in every state to harass or threaten election officials or any citizen. I would note that this was a problem that we wish we had Congress's support for back when I was in the Department of Homeland Security, instead of encouraging people who were performing the kind of unrest that you heard just described in Detroit. As you know, I previously served as Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. I've been the Attorney General of Virginia, and I currently serve as the chairman of the Election Transparency Initiative, where we work every day to help improve the transparency, security, accessibility, safety, and accountability of elections in every state, so every American, regardless of their party affiliation or the color of their skin, can have confidence in the outcome of every election. Today, it's easier to register and vote than it ever has been before in our history, regardless of where you live, what color you are, or what party you vote for. We should be celebrating this as a great accomplishment while always looking to improve. Instead, many in Congress would like to impose federal takeover in various pieces. The particular bill you've talked about today is one smaller piece, but we've heard the previous speakers talk about the federal preclearance bill, the John Lewis bill incoming, H.R. 1, as Mr. Sarbanes mentioned, and suggest that access to voting today is actually worse than it was in 1965, which is patently outrageous. But the lying demagoguery coming from much of the radical left, including the title of this hearing, is not constructive and represents a large-scale attempt to knowingly convince the American people of a false narrative, namely that since the Shelby County ruling by the Supreme Court in 2013, America has been suffering from a rash of voter suppression, including violence. Thankfully, the data demonstrates this narrative is blatantly false. And rather than make general allegations, let me be specific about some of the radical leftists who are lying to the American people. It starts at the top with President Biden. Even the leftist Washington Post had to give President Biden their strongest lying rating of 4 Pinocchios for his blatantly false statements about Georgia's recent election reform efforts. And he is the highest voice shouting the now familiar trope of Jim Crow 2.0, which we heard Congressman Owens speak to so eloquently and from his own personal experience. Not to be left out, Vice President Harris recently flip-flopped from her anti-voter ID position in an interview on BET, an interview in which that flip-flop was overshadowed by her comment that people who live in rural communities aren't capable, i.e. smart enough, to use voter IDs to conduct their voting. Vice President Harris's rural people are stupid view is no less prejudiced than her view shared implicitly by so many others on the left, that minorities are somehow incapable of getting and using voter IDs like everyone else. And I hear very little discussion of how critical these IDs are to just participate in our society and its economic opportunities. A sad commentary. In addition to the data simply not supporting this prejudiced view, it's one of the most offensive aspects of the entire contemporary public discussion. One of the most senior members of this body, Congressman Clyburn, recently not only flip-flopped on his previous position that requiring voter IDs is racist, but even denied ever holding such a position. And beyond just that, He further denied that anyone in Congress ever held such a position. Given that members of this very committee have suggested that requiring voter ID is suppressionist at least, or racist at worst, you all know Congressman Clyburn's denial was without foundation. And like President Biden, Congressman Clyburn also earned the Washington Post's 4 Pinocchios rating for his lies on the subject. Of course, no list of lying left-wing race baiters would be complete without Stacey Abrams, who, like Congressman Clyburn, both flip-flopped on her voter ID is racist position and denied ever holding such a position. And most recently, Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf staged a spectacular flip-flop of his own, suddenly declaring he is now open to changing the state's voter ID laws less than 3 weeks after vetoing a common sense piece of updating legislation that included voter ID provisions called the Voting Rights Protection Act, brought forward by their General Assembly. What do these flip-flopping race baiters have in common? 2 things: timing and polling. What do I mean? First, because of the political necessity of getting federal legislation through a 50-50 Senate, following West Virginia Senator Manchin's indication he'd require some sort of voter ID to support national legislation, President Biden, Vice President Harris, Congressman Clyburn, Stacey Abrams, and many others on the left had to cast aside their false voter ID is racist mantra.
The gentleman's time has expired. I'll give a little more time to wrap up, but
I will wrap up.
We've been easy on the gavel with everyone, but
yes, ma'am. I'll wrap up. Second, the polling has not shifted despite 6 months of attacks. American people still support access and integrity measures, which continue even in this hearing to be called voter suppression. And I'll wrap my time up. I look forward to discussing these subjects further. Thank the chairwoman for the additional time.
the gentleman's time has expired. This is now the time in our hearing when members of the committee may pose questions for 5 minutes to the witnesses. I'll turn first to our ranking member, Mr. Davis, for questions that he may have.
First off, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Cuccinelli, for your testimony today. We've had a lot of debate about Congress's role in federal elections. Republicans believe that states have the primary role in administering elections and that Congress's role is purely secondary. At our last committee hearing, we heard testimony from the majority's witnesses suggesting that the Elections Clause gives Congress carte blanche power over how states administer federal elections. Mr. Sarbanes' bill goes into excruciating detail explaining why Democrats think they can nationalize elections. Now, Mr. Cuccinelli, do you agree with their interpretation of the Elections Clause?
No, I think that the elements in the longer form of your statement referencing the founding perspective on that are exactly what was anticipated when the Constitution was written, when this clause was put in place, and it's shown by the history of America. For 230 years, states have run our elections since the Constitution, even with the absolutely necessary Voting Rights Act, which was one of the most extraordinary federal interventions in state-run elections in our history, probably the most and the most needed. Even that was recognized by the Supreme Court as resulting from extreme circumstances that absolutely existed at that time that have been remedied, as the Supreme Court has also said. And when you look at, I'll just take the part of Mr. Sarbanes' recent bill that jumped out at me, where you seek to have the federal government essentially invade state and local prerogatives of hiring and firing their own officials. This is an area that has been dealt with to some degree, not squarely, but to some degree in 10th Amendment litigation. This is an area where the federal government simply doesn't have the power to go in and tell a state how to do its business.
Well, thank you. And I think you would agree, Mr. Cuccinelli, that Congress's role in this space is really not getting involved except in incredibly serious situations, right?
I think that is both the history, and I think there's an extraordinary amount of support for that position just from the founders who wrote and passed the Constitution. So I think that's the predominant legal view out there. Of course, it's never been fully litigated all the way out. And so I ascribe to the 80-20 rule as a litigator, but that is where the preponderance of the scholarship resides.
Well, thank you, Mr. Cuccinelli. Again, Mr. Fontes, as you know, this committee sends out official government staff to observe the administration of federal elections under its authority under House rules and the Constitution. During the last election, Maricopa County unbelievably refused access to any congressional observers, both Republicans and Democrats, who were forced to peer through a lobby window in order to see any of the process. Isn't sunlight the best disinfectant? Why should observer access be limited?
Madam Chair, Mr. Davis, I don't know if I have to go directly through the chair in these hearings.
No, just the witness can answer.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ranking Member, I'm not exactly sure where you're getting your facts from, but authorized observers who were authorized according to Arizona state law, and I know you're a proponent of states making the rules, had all of the access that was required and granted as appropriate in Maricopa County during the entire 2020 election cycle.
Well, we'll get you some evidence from our official election observers from the House as to the problems they had, and I certainly hope we can work better together in the future to make sure that doesn't happen to either side when we're out doing our constitutional duty. How much money did you budget to administer the 2020 elections?
Mr. Davis, we budgeted well over $23 million. The issue that we ended up having, of course, was the global pandemic that I don't think anybody finally realized the impact financially. So it ended up being a heck of a lot more than that we spent. Public outreach, safety equipment, PPE, finding and locating new places where we could have our vote centers so that folks could vote at appropriate social distances and so forth. So the number of dollars that we budgeted certainly didn't amount to what we ended up paying.
Does that number include the CARES Act money that Maricopa County got? And I believe that's $399 million.
Well, that would not have been included in the budget because the CARES Act was passed way after our budget was passed, sir.
Okay. Well, I see I'm out of time, so I will yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Raskin is participating remotely. Mr. Raskin, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks so much, Madam Chair, for calling this really important hearing. Mr. Fontes, in your testimony, you talk about all of the security measures that Maricopa County had to undertake during the 2020 election, including bringing in a SWAT team where you were counting ballots in order to prevent for the possibility of violence or turmoil in the event that the armed protesters outside the building got in. Can you explain how the security situation and the threats you received affected your operations and the staff?
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. The threats really were certainly not anticipated, and they had a significant and severe impact on the staff. Some of the impact included folks having to deal with circumstances well beyond just what happened at the time. The anxiety, it was very difficult at some point after the election, once a lot of the threats and the protests outside of our building happened, to make sure that election workers would come back. Folks had to be escorted back and forth to their vehicles by armed guards of the Judicial Protective Services and the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department. And it's not a normal situation when fully armed and fully armored SWAT teams have to be present, because that's what security officials recommend. When folks are outside armed with AR-15 style and AK-47 style weapons, essentially threatening to storm the building. And that's a kind of a stressful situation that no civil servant, no election administrator should ever have to deal with. But they came through. And I have to say again, I'm incredibly grateful to the tens of thousands of people across the country, but particularly my team at the Maricopa County Recorder's Office and Elections Department. They came through with flying colors under the worst situation.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for your service. Ms. Ramachandran, you found, as part of this Brennan Center for Justice survey of election workers nationwide, that 1 in 3 election workers feels unsafe because of their job, and 1 in 5 say that their lives have been threatened in the context of their work. You spoke to a lot of elected officials in the drafting of this report. Can you explain what is going on out there? Are they afraid of the kind of violence that came to the House and the Senate on January 6th, where 140 of our police officers were wounded and injured and ended up in the hospital?
Thank you for the question. I would say that in speaking to numerous election officials from members of both parties, by the way, we spoke to both Republican and Democratic election officials. Yes, the fear that they're feeling is actually very analogous to the fear that I imagine was felt on January 6th during those tragic events. And to my mind, the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th was actually a form of an attack on election officials, because the members of Congress were fulfilling their duty, their ministerial duty to count electoral votes, and there was an attempt to interfere with that. So I think it's very analogous.
What was the role that social media has played in circulating and promoting these threats against election officials?
Who is that question directed to, Mr. Raskin?
Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Ramachandran, I'm asking about the role of social media disinformation in the circulation of threats and the creation of a climate of uncertainty and anxiety among election officials.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for that question. Many of the election officials we spoke to said that absolutely social media is playing a huge role in the dissemination of disinformation and therefore the instigation of these threats. So something could start with actually an innocent misunderstanding to be posted on social media and then get picked up by a prominent official, whether it's a television celebrity or a prominent election official, and then just spread like wildfire. And of course, election officials attempted to speak the truth on social media and in traditional media and educate voters about how votes were really being counted and how elections really work. But it's so difficult for them to compete with TV celebrities and, you know, even the president of the United States. They definitely need help in order to be able to communicate accurate information and combat that disinformation.
And sticking with you, what are your policy recommendations for protecting the security of election officials so they can do their jobs?
Well, in our report, we are recommending that Congress provide funding for physical security protections and trainings. So, for instance, many election officials we spoke with said that they received recommendations from the police to do things like set up a doorbell camera at their homes, but they just didn't have the money in their budgets to provide for that sort of thing. So we think financial support from both state and the federal government would be incredibly beneficial.
Thank you, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you again for a number of hearings that we've had regarding elections. Been nice to had some of these, majority of these hearings before H.R. 1 actually ran its way to the floor. I think that would have been very, very productive. I do want to follow up on something that my good friend Mr. Davis had touched on, and Mr. Cuccinelli was touching on. It was regarding the Voting Rights Act. You know, that was a very important piece of legislation, and it fell within the line of what the courts and the Constitution and our founders intended, which is the qualification of electors. In other words, who can vote? That is something that has clearly been within the federal purview. It's who can vote. They were also very clear that the times, places, and manner was to be interpreted literally, and that was reserved for the states. And so, yes, the Voting Rights Act, which my colleagues have cited quite often, was definitely about the electors who can vote. That is in the Constitution. That is a federal issue. The rest is reserved to the states. Also, something that Mr. Raskin brought up is the role of social media has played in disinformation. Maybe that could be some of the explanations why the current president of the United States spread false information about Georgia's election law. So I do think it's imperative for everyone to seek the truth in things, especially when it comes to elections and election law, not just following your own emotions. And Mr. Davis and I also have experienced what can happen when misinformation is spread on the internet, when gunman walked on a baseball field and started shooting at us about 4 years ago. With that, I also appreciate the testimony of Mr. Owens, someone who has truly experienced what Jim Crow really is and how bad that is and how unacceptable that is. But I'm concerned about how many on the other side are so quick to claim that any attempt to strengthen the integrity of our elections is racist or it equates to this Jim Crow era. I think that's asinine. I think it throws into the face of many people of both parties that I know back home who want to know that their vote is the one that counts and those that should not be voting are not voting, are not allowed to vote. Mr. Cuccinelli, it's good to see you again. I appreciate you being here. Do you think that the voter ID requirements that many states have and some that have proposed represent a subversion of democracy as some on the other side here have suggested?
That could hardly be farther from the case. Voter identification is broadly supported as a common sense measure of securing elections. And you've seen a lot of states, many of them that already have in-person voter ID, with the explosion in the COVID-19 era of mail-based voting and absentee voting, that they are they're providing equal security or attempting to for mail-in ballots as they have for in-person ballots. That's logical, it's commonsensical, and it's reasonable to see this path when you see such a massive sudden growth in that form of voting. So the whole idea and the attack, the baseless propaganda attack of voter ID as racist or suppressive somehow is clearly false enough that many leaders on this literally just threw it overboard when it became politically inexpedient because of Senator Joe Manchin's position over in the Senate, in the 50-50 Senate. And so I can't possibly imagine that all those folks would have suddenly just declared it not to be racist if they'd ever actually thought that in the first place. It tells me they didn't think it in the first place.
Right, and I think the poll numbers that came out around that time may have influenced it as well, which the majority of Republicans and Democrats and independents support ID. In fact, in a previous hearing, I asked the former Attorney General, Mr. Holder, the question of whether or not he supported now voter ID, and he did shift a little bit from his written testimony, which he said, yes, as long as there's no restriction on the type of ID, which is basically saying there's no validity to it, right?
Well, but realize that every state that requires voter identification today offers it for free. Right. So the burden has been reduced enormously. And also keep in mind that folks that don't have any kind of identification would have an extremely hard time participating fully in our society as it operates today. So this goes well beyond voting, and it should be one of those things that, as ordinary Americans do, that we should all be able to agree on.
All right. Well, our chair has been very generous with her time, but I don't think she's going to give me the time to go into another question right now. But thank you very much, and I appreciate you and your time with us.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Butterfield is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for convening this very important hearing on election subversion, a growing threat to electoral integrity. This is a very necessary conversation that we must have. Thank you to the four witnesses for your testimony today. It's been very valuable in this process. I'm going to start with Ms. Ramachandran. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right, but let me start with you, please. In your written testimony and in the report, Election Officials Under Attack, you discuss how disinformation, including the unprecedented lies of the Stop the Steal movement, have directly impacted election officials. Could you please talk with me just a little bit about the kind of disinformation we saw following the 2020 election about the accuracy of election results and how that led to threats against election officials such as Ms. Winfrey?
Thank you so much for that question. So many of the election officials we spoke with talked about the fact that they started receiving numerous phone calls from members of the public with questions about how votes were counted, the types of machines that were used, that sort of thing. And these phone calls themselves took an emotional and time toll on them and their staff. Many times the phone call would take upwards of 15 to 20 minutes to complete, and the caller still wouldn't be convinced after all of that honest patient time. And it was an emotional toll because many times the callers were essentially accusing election officials and their staff of themselves having committed some sort of widespread fraud. And that's a particularly stinging accusation when the truth is that election officials and their staff performed like heroes to ensure that everyone could vote safely and securely and that every eligible voter's vote would be accurately counted. And then, of course, many of the voicemails and threatening messages they received included accusations that the official or the worker had engaged in some sort of fraud or had stolen the election. So they saw a clear connection between that disinformation and the threats that they were receiving. And I will also note that many election officials noted they had never experienced anything like this before in terms of the volume of calls and the amount.
Now, I know the Brennan Center has done a lot of research in this area, and I know you've done some as well. Let me ask you this. You've mentioned some of the policy recommendations that you all have come up with. Can you give me one or two other policy recommendations that you may not have mentioned earlier in your testimony?
Sure, and thank you so much for that opportunity. So one of the recommendations I didn't go into detail on is really a recommendation for the private social media companies. And that is that they could use, if they had a list of the more than 8,000 verified local election officials in the United States, they could use that registry to amplify the voices of those election officials with truthful, accurate information so that they would have a chance against the flood of lies from more prominent and famous folks that sometimes try to spread these things.
All right, let me go to the distinguished clerk from the great city of Detroit. Thank you very much for your testimony. First of all, Madam Clerk, in your testimony, you describe what I would call a horrific experience of having to defend the election that you oversaw while battling COVID-19 and being physically threatened. And I'm sorry you had to go through all of that, and I think your reaction was very normal, as it would be for any other person in that situation. How have these threats and the intimidation and the unfounded questioning of the validity of the elections process impacted your staff? You talked about the impact that it had on you and your family. Let's talk about those hard-working men and women on your team. How has it impacted them physically, emotionally, and mentally?
Yeah, so a number of my senior staff decided to take off work to do the FMLA. So I lost about 5 members to FMLA, and they didn't come back until after the canvass of the election, after the elections were certified. One retired, but the overall climate at the Department of Elections is one of fear almost. People are wanting to retire. Those of us that came down with COVID-19, two of my senior staff were hospitalized with it. Because this was all happened after the election. We process 1,000 ballots a day. These are ballots that are processed in person during the COVID. And yes, we had our protective gear on, but we all suffered with COVID-19.
That's what I suspected. Thank you very much for that, and please share with your employees that we appreciate their work.
Thank you.
Regardless of their party affiliation, we appreciate their work.
And we appreciate yours.
You're back.
Gentleman's time is expired, and Mr. Stile is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate you holding today's hearing.
1 or 2, right?
I think it's really important as we look at this that today Democrats are continuing to spread misinformation about election laws in Republican-controlled states. They're calling provisions restrictive if it's from a Republican state, while ignoring state laws from Democrat states, in particular Massachusetts, Delaware, Connecticut. Why? Partisan politics. Democrats are trying to use this cover to justify a federal takeover of state election laws. And I'm going to continue to fight against a federal government takeover of state election laws. I think everybody watching this committee hearing should be paying attention that we're pointing out Republican-controlled states and failing to identify or talk about any of the Democratic-controlled states that have the same laws in place. Let me shift gears, if I can, to you, Ms. Winfrey. I appreciate you being here today. As clerk, you were responsible for administering the 2020 general election. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And do you support voter identification for voters?
I do.
You
I do.
So you support voter ID in your jurisdiction?
It's the law.
Thank you very much. And in Detroit, did you receive any grant funding from the Center for Tech and Civil Life, CTCL, if you will, the nonprofit organization funded by Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg for the 2020 election?
I did.
And what was the total amount of grants funded for the city of Detroit received from CTCL for the 2020 election cycle?
About $8 million.
About $8 million. I have 7.4, about $8 million. What was the total amount of funds the city of Detroit received from other non-governmental sources?
I'm not sure what the other city, my budget is totally separate from the other, from administration, if you will.
Were there other
general
funds that came in from other nonprofits outside of government entities in the city of Detroit in addition to CTCL, to your knowledge?
As it relates to the Department of Elections, we received $8 million. That's my budget.
That's okay. Did you accept any personnel that were paid for by any non-government entity to assist or be involved with the conduct of the 2020 elections?
We received support from CTCL.
Support. Did they report to you or did they report to
no, not
CTCL?
physically. Not physically. Not physically support to me. They are employees. They supported or they reported to CTCL, but they worked with us during the election process.
Okay, and did you apply or seek out any election administration funding?
Yes.
Outside funding?
Yes.
You did?
Yes.
And so you sought that out. I appreciate your testimony. Let me shift gears, if I can, to you, Mr. Cuccinelli. You note in your testimony that the 1902 Virginia Constitution imposed such barriers as poll taxes, literacy tests, and even a civics test as hurdles to registration and voting, kind of disgusting practices in the past. Does any state impose such devices today?
No, elements of them were employed up into the 1960s, and the Voting Rights Act wiped them out very quickly. And they have not been in use anywhere in the United States since very shortly after the Voting Rights Act went into effect.
And so would you say that there's definitely always room for improvement, that the U.S. is fair to say we've made pretty drastic strides from 1965 to 2021?
Well, the numbers show it. I put some of them I pulled a New York Times graph there for my statement. You can see the massive increase in African American participation, which is particularly relevant in a state like Virginia, where Black citizens are a fifth of our state. So that's a critical improvement. It's measurable all across the country. And not every state is the same, but we've come a long, long way wiping out those differences.
Appreciate it. Let me keep rolling here because I got limited time. If you in particular, I think you quite correctly note that many, I think we have just been ignoring, is that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which outlawed many of the discriminatory voting practices referenced earlier by me, remain on the books. How should Section 2 be employed, in your opinion?
Section 2 should be made permanent and should be used as it's written to root out actual discrimination, which was also addressed in the Brnovich case recently. And it's still there to be used that way. Some people in the Congress talk as if it isn't.
And final question for you. Do you support voter identification for voters?
Photo identification and voter identification, yes.
Thank you very much. Madam Chairwoman, I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Fontes, last week, the former Republican Secretary of State, Ken Bennett, was barred from his own audit. As I understand it, he's working with the state Senate on that audit within the state of Arizona as they continue to engage in actions on the false premise of misconduct during the 2020 elections. The audit's being focused on Maricopa County, where you used to work. Can you please explain how misinformation and disinformation campaigns that balloon into these ridiculous audits affect our nation's election integrity efforts, and the dangers of partisan audits being conducted by individuals who don't have any experience?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Aguilar. I think the first piece of misinformation and disinformation is actually calling what's happening right now in Arizona an audit. It is nothing of the sort. It never has been, and it was not intended to be. And I don't know any auditor who has any sort of professional certification who will stand by what is happening with Maricopa County's 2020 election, its ballots, its equipment, its data and information, and audit. That notwithstanding, misinformation and disinformation has moved a lot of normally reasonable people in Arizona and across the country to question what is a normal exercise conducted by average citizens just like you and me and anybody else out there. For some reason, the misinformation and disinformation has raised so much mistrust in basic systems. Systems, by the way, which are run by, in many cases, the political parties themselves. As an example, the mandatory hand count audit that is mandated by state law in Arizona, the county party chairs of the political parties are the ones who select the folks who perform the audit. They are the ones who oversee that audit and who are essentially coached in process only by the elections department after the election. So that hand count audit that is mandated by state law is actually performed by partisans in order to maintain the integrity of what is happening in every county in Arizona, not just in Maricopa County. That's just one example of how misunderstandings arise. Another really important example is the allegations of Sharpiegate, for example. In 2018, we had a very different election system. We had different ballot styles. We had different ballot paper. The machines themselves that tabulated ballots operated on a completely different architecture. They were completely different than what we have in 2020. And that's why Sharpies were not recommended in 2018, but were recommended in 2020. And I can get into details if you'd like. But the reality is this. There are folks out there who want to subvert our democracy. There are folks out there who don't want every eligible U.S. citizen to vote. I don't count myself among them. There are folks out there who are afraid of the voice of America's voters. And in order to advance their political agenda, they think it's better to have less voters voting, to have a diminished American voice. And I think that's wrong. And that's why I'm partially here, particularly, though, to help election officials across the United States at the local, municipal, and state level stay safe. And that's one of the critical components that we've seen. The misinformation and disinformation leads to those threats of violence, leads to that problem, and I appreciate that.
Ms. Ramachandran, the Brennan Center for Justice and the Bipartisan Policy Center report on election officials under attack claims that state legislatures are introducing bills that impose criminal penalties on election officials and workers, including penalties that could strip power away from these local officials. Even if states counter these actions by enacting new laws to ensure greater protections of election officials, do you believe federal policy is necessary to prevent attacks against public servants, and if so, why?
Thank you for that question. I do believe that even though currently elections are administered largely at the local level in the United States, those local election officials are the guardians of our federal democracy, of federal elections. So I do think that Congress has a role to play in protecting those local election officials to ensure that the federal elections they administer are administered without undue, interference or coercion.
Thank you. Ms. Winfrey, according to the Democracy Fund, almost 35% of election officials are set to retire before the next presidential election, representing more than 50% of local election officials in the largest jurisdictions. Should communities of color and predominantly Black and Hispanic communities be concerned that the pipeline of local professionals could change from capable and trustworthy individuals, including making elections decisions that have disparate impact on communities?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Over the past several years, disinformation about American elections has spread like a disease across the country. What was once the province of foreign adversaries seeking to undermine our elections, election disinformation is now homegrown, created and stoked by political leaders, members of Congress, and even the former president, and then amplified by the echo chambers of our foreign enemies. By spreading the lie of widespread election fraud with a particular focus on cities and black and brown communities, these domestic enemies of democracy have used their positions of leadership to spread conspiracy theories about demonstrably false threats to election security in order to justify actions to undermine actual election security, whether through fraudulent audits or new laws that make it both harder to vote and easier to steal elections. The consequences of these falsehoods and the refusal of members of his party to contradict the former president's lies about the accuracy of the 2020 election have had disastrous consequences. In addition to a violent attack upon the Capitol, the disinformation campaign led by the former president and his allies has caused widespread and persistent intimidation and threats against election officials, including death threats being made against officials ranging from apolitical local civil servants all the way up to and including the Vice President and members of the U.S. Congress, as we sought to certify the Electoral College votes. In Pennsylvania, every county has a bipartisan board of election, but national actors, including the former president and members of this committee, made false allegations about the integrity of election procedures in only the Democratic-led counties of Pennsylvania. In my district, a Republican election commissioner for the city of Philadelphia was named by the former president when he tweeted that the commissioner was a so-called rhino being used big time by fake news media. He refuses to look at a mountain of corruption and dishonesty we win. This tweet and attacks from the Trump campaign surrogates that followed resulted in waves of anti-Semitic, intimidating threats against the commissioner and explicit death threats against his children, threats that mentioned their names and ages. Elsewhere in my district, the individual members of the bipartisan volunteer Delaware County Election Board were sued dozens of times in cases that sought to overturn the duly certified results of the election and to fine or jail those officials for faithfully executing their duties. In each case, those cases were dismissed as being without merit, but they nevertheless required the expenditure of substantial government funds and personal time to defend them. So although attempts to overturn the 2020 election results failed, the harm to our elections and election officials has been real. I introduced legislation to make it a federal crime to intimidate or harass an election official for performing their duties, and Representative Sarbanes has now introduced expanded legislation to protect our election workers. I'm proud to co-sponsor this effort. It's also imperative that our elected leaders recognize that their words matter, that if they willfully seek to spread disinformation about our elections, they, like the former president, should not be reelected. Mr. Fontes and Ms. Winfrey, I'd like to thank both of you for your work as election officials under the extraordinary public health and political challenges of the past couple years. In normal times, these jobs are intensive and stressful, but your work has been essential. I'd like to ask each of you to address what do you think Congress should do to aid in protecting you from continued threats and violence and enable you to do your work. Mr. Fontes?
Thank you for that question. The critical component here, I think, that Congress can do is recognize that there is a difference between what we do as election administrators and what a lot of other people do. And of course, all of the work of government is important in its own way. But election administration is the golden thread that holds the fabric of America together. And it is a bipartisan effort. And without the current legislation, we will continue to see the threats and intimidation and violence rise. And so to directly answer the question, you can help by passing the bill that's on the table.
Okay. Ms. Winfrey?
I agree, the same thing. We need laws to protect us. We're simply doing our jobs. I'm nonpartisan in my job, and as such, me and my staff, we shouldn't be threatened. We shouldn't do the job fearfully. All we want are clear, clean, fair elections.
Thank you. And I don't see the clock where. 12 seconds. Okay, then I will end by asking unanimous consent to enter 3 articles in the record, 2 articles detailing the threats and intimidation experienced by the Philadelphia Election Commissioner and his family, and a third article from the New York Times dated July 2nd, 2021, entitled, "After a Nightmare Year, Election Officials Are Quitting." And I yield back.
Without objection, those will be entered into the record, and the gentlelady from New Mexico is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. You know, today we're holding this hearing to talk about how the big lie by Trump and his allies that this presidential election was stolen has led to threats of violence, and here at this Capitol, actual violence. And I am incredibly disappointed that our Republican colleagues have not addressed the violence and the threats itself, which is what this committee hearing is about today. They have not listened to your testimony and the difficulties that you have faced, that your families have faced, and that your colleagues have faced, and those you supervise. And that is a difficulty that I apologize that this entire committee has not focused on as equally as others. So I wanted to ask a little bit about the connection that you see and how you experience the connection between what we saw here on January 6th and what the nation heard in testimony yesterday from the police officers who faced torture, violence, pain, and asked Congress to do something about it. So I'd like you to talk about how you see that connection with what you yourselves are facing. Mr. Fontes.
Thank you for that. If I could, this isn't just about me or Clerk Winfrey. This is about all election officials across the country. We are a unified band of bipartisan brothers and sisters and cousins and aunts and uncles. We learn from one another, we exchange best practices, and we certainly do share our experiences. And I think I'm joined by so many people across the country looking in horror at what happened here on January 6th, but also what could have been just after the election in November of 2020. We had armed almost rioters in Maricopa County. We had Alex Jones and the Q shaman literally arm in arm shouting my name and shouting for other election officials in the parking lot. And their compatriots armed with some pretty heavy-duty firearms. And I know, because I was a range coach and marksmanship instructor in the Marine Corps, I know what kind of damage those weapons could do. And that was certainly no civil act of protest. That was not a grievance. The presence of those weapons in this environment was a threat. And that was very difficult. It was a step away from what happened here. And I hope and pray that everyone will pay attention to this, because the Republic depends on folks like us who work in a bipartisan way, who work, Republicans and Democrats, independents, libertarians, Greens, everybody works together to do this across the country. And this, it needs to end. The motivation behind these threats is the lie. That needs to end. Reasonable people have to come together in the United States of America to say enough is enough. And folks like us who just want to do our jobs, who just did our jobs, need to stand up and I think say the same thing. And I think Clerk Winfrey would agree with me on that.
I do. It's what we're going through is very much the same as what happened here, except for they're coming to our homes and they're making us very uncomfortable. Some of my colleagues have been shot at simply because of what we do. All of us have been threatened, and because we're trying to represent our community. If it weren't for the work of local election officials, none of you would be here in this room. We just want to uphold democracy. We just want to ensure that everyone votes, and it's unfair. It's unfair that we're attacked for doing our job. I feel afraid. I feel afraid. I know that I'm going to get some kind of repercussion from just this sitting here today. But I decided to do it because I believe in the right to vote. I believe that every eligible elector should be allowed to vote easily and fairly.
Well, thank you. What you are doing today and what you do in your work and what your colleagues do your work, that is true patriotism. And those who attack it or who would limit it, that is truly un-American, and we must call it for what it is. It is un-American. I see my time is coming to an end. Madam Chair, I'd like to submit for the record a Reuters special report. The Trump-inspired death threats are terrorizing election workers. And similar to the Brennan Center report, it documents just incidents after incidents of violence threatened against those who carry on and uphold our democracy on a day-to-day basis. Madam Chair.
Thank you. Without objection, those items will be put into the record. I now recognize myself for a few minutes of questions. First, let me thank all of the witnesses for the testimony that they have provided. It's important to inform this committee and the American public what we as a country are facing. You know, I heard from both of you, local elected officials, about the threats of violence related to simply counting the ballots. Mr. Fontes, I wonder, you alluded to, you know, the concern in the parking lot. Can you describe, give us a picture, if your words, draw us a picture for what was around Maricopa County's counting site?
Thank you, Chair Lofgren. The front parking lot, if you will, of the warehouse is framed by 3rd Avenue and Lincoln in downtown Phoenix, Arizona. And the parking lot is sort of framed on the north and the west by what's almost a two-story building. On the west, it's a two-story building, but a rather large off-the-ground part of the warehouse on the north side. And in the parking lot itself, we made sure, in working with security officials, that the folks who wanted to come out and share their grievances, like the First Amendment says, petition their government for that redress, had space enough to be able to have their voices heard. Now, we didn't put up a security fence and a perimeter until after some incidences where folks had literally forced their way into the lobby. We tried to keep it as open as possible. We tried to be as transparent, as open as possible with the media and members of the public as well.
Can I follow up with a question? Because, you know, I was in local government for a long time, 14 years. We ran the elections. We had the registrar of voters. We never had a situation where people came and demonstrated while the votes were being counted. People, you vote, you have elections. That never happened. Was demonstrations about counting the votes, is that being fueled, in your judgment, by the big lie?
Well, Chair Lofgren, we've never had a sitting president of the United States of America say, if I lose, it's because there was fraud. We've never had a group of politicians in the United States of America willing to carry on with that kind of sycophancy, with that kind of irresponsible deterioration of the confidence that the American people should hold in our most fundamental of institutions. We've never been here as a republic. And we can see now how fragile this democracy, this experiment in democracy really is. And it is disappointing, to say the very least, that we've gotten to the point where folks like my former staff and folks like Clerk Winfrey's current and future staff, election officials across the country who just want to do their jobs. They just want to be the folks who get that work done because they know how important it is. We all know how important it is. Again, to parrot Clerk Winfrey, none of you would be here if it wasn't for local election officials. We've never been here because we've never had a significant group of elected officials in this country irresponsible enough to render asunder the confidence that we have in our election systems. It is a horrible new place that we find ourselves in, and we have to end it.
And in your judgment, does that really threaten the future viability of our democratic republic?
Madam Chair, we were just a few minutes away in this very building on January 6th from not carrying through with our constitutional duties, which was, up until this year, a normal, everyday, regular, boring process. We are in dangerous new territory, Madam Chair, in my view, and unfortunately we have to fight to get back to where we ought to be.
Thank you. Clerk Winfrey, prior to 2020, did you ever have demonstrations about while the votes were being counted in Detroit?
Yes, we have. Not to the level that we had in 2020, but yes, we would have challengers, Republican and Democratic challengers in the TCF Center, and sometimes they would bump heads, but not to the level where they were banging on the walls and saying and yelling, "Stop the vote." We never had it like this. We never had to have police officers and armed officers in the room with us as we tabulated votes.
Well, I want to thank you for speaking out, both of you and all the witnesses, but especially the local elected officials. You will be going home, and hopefully you will be safe when you go home. But we do thank you for your testimony as well as the other witnesses. I will just note that, yesterday, 3 members of this committee that also serve on the select committee investigating the insurrection, and we heard very difficult testimonies from really 4 amazing police officers who laid their bodies on the line, really, to protect the members of this committee, the staff, everybody in this building, but more than anything else, to protect democracy. And we came alarmingly close to the insurrectionists being successful. And today, we're hearing from election officials about violence directed to them, about simply counting the votes. It was interesting to hear, Mr. Fontes, your comment about a boring process. It used to be boring. I can remember times when actually I didn't come back for the Electoral College counting because there's nothing to do. I mean, you just watch them be counted, and that is that. Similarly, counting the ballots. I mean, it was something that the clerks did, and we thank them for it, but it was not a high-profile item. It was just the work that had to be done. We are witnessing a distortion of democratic processes here that I think is a serious threat to our country. I think your testimony has further enlightened us, and I hope that as we move forward, all of us, no matter what our party, will take this threat seriously, because it's not about which party you're in. It's about being an American. So I thank you all. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses. If so, we will ask you to respond to those questions in writing. The hearing record will be held open for those responses. And again, thank you to all our witnesses. Without objection, the Committee on House Administration stands adjourned.